The wind over the Belgian countryside carried an uneasy silence in the early hours of December 1944. Soldiers huddled in frozen foxholes, breath turning to vapor. Hands numb on rifles they hoped they wouldn't have to fire. All around them, miles of forest and farmland waited for something terrible to begin. No one knew exactly when the Germans would strike, but everyone felt the tremor of an approaching storm. And in the center of this bleak, frozen world stood a young private from Tennessee who couldn't have known that, within hours, he'd be marching alone into a wall of gunfire. 20,000 bullets slicing around him, on a mission everyone called hopeless, suicidal, impossible. Yet he walked forward anyway. Before the world came to know his name, before newspapers called him a miracle or a legend, he was just a quiet kid raised far from any battlefield. His hometown was the sort of place where people worked, sunrise to sunset, where the land shaped the rhythm of life, and where a man's reputation was built on honesty, grit, and whether he kept his word. He grew up surrounded by hills, farms, and a kind of silent city folk never hear. Most days he woke to the sound of animals, the clatter of tools, and the steady hum of a life lived with purpose, but without much noise. He was the kind of boy who fixed fences without being asked, who carried more weight on his back than some grown men, and who rarely complained. Because in that world, complaining didn't fix anything. When neighbors described him, long before the war, they said he was polite, humble, and unshakably steady. They never imagined that same unassuming young man would one day walk into the jaws of enemy fire like it was just another afternoon chore. But war has a way of rewriting the paths people expect to follow. When he enlisted, he wasn't searching for glory or recognition. He wasn't trying to prove himself to anyone. His country was calling, and like so many others, he answered because he believed he should. Training camps hardened him, shaved down the softness of farm life, and replaced it with a soldier's instinct. But no amount of drills or marches could prepare him for what waited in the Ardennes forest. By December 1944, the war in Europe seemed to be nearing its end. The Allies had liberated France, pushed deeper into Belgium, and felt the enemy weakening. Some believed the Germans had run out of strength for any major attack, but hidden behind dense winter fog, deep inside the woods, Hitler was preparing a desperate gamble, an enormous counteroffensive designed to split the Allied line in two and force a negotiated peace. It would be remembered as the Battle of the Bulge. In those early days, chaos washed over the front lines. German tanks broke through weak points. Allied units were overrun, cut off, or surrounded. Radios crackled with frantic calls for support. Snow fell harder, turning roads into ice and burying equipment in white drifts. The bitter cold bit through wool uniforms and soaked boots until toes went numb. Every soldier felt the weight of the situation, but none more than the small groups left exposed on lonely ridges and crossroads. Groups like the one he was assigned to. His unit had been in, but ordered to hold a strategically important point overlooking a valley the Germans needed to advance through. It wasn't a comfortable position. It wasn't even a well-defended one. They had few heavy weapons, limited supplies, and almost no reinforcements. Their only advantage was the terrain, a slope that forced attackers to come uphill, and their determination not to give ground easily. For days, they heard rumblings in the distance, tanks grinding through the forest, artillery rolling into position, German voices echoing from somewhere just beyond the trees. Every man sensed that the real fight was coming. Some whispered nervously. Others fell silent. A few wrote letters home, knowing full well they might never send them. Then, in a shuddering roar, the attack finally began. Artillery shells screamed overhead, exploding in violent bursts that shook the earth. Trees splintered. Snow erupted into towering fountains. Men ducked into whatever shelter they could find. The morning sky turned black with smoke. It felt less like an offensive and more like the end of the world. And beneath it all, he kept his head low, jaw clenched. Mind focused, not on fear, but on what had to be done. When the shelling stopped, the Germans came. A wave of infantry surged through the smoke, rifles raised. Machine guns firing sweeping arcs up the slope. The defenders fought back with everything they had, but their numbers were small, and the enemy kept coming in bigger and bigger waves. Soon, ammunition ran dangerously low. Communication wires were cut. Soldiers shouted over the gunfire, trying to coordinate desperately. And just when it seemed the line might crumble completely, a new threat appeared in the near distance, something that made even the most seasoned men freeze. A massive German machine gun nest had taken position behind a rise in the terrain. Its guns opened up with deadly precision, peppering the hillside with a storm of bullets. Anyone who lifted their head more than a few inches risked having it taken off. Men were pinned down, unable to retreat or advance. They were trapped. Someone had to silence those guns. Someone had to do it fast, or the entire unit would be overrun. Officers exchanged terrified looks. No one had a plan. No one volunteered. Why would they? Charging straight into that kind of fire wasn't bravery. It was suicide. The Germans had the high ground, sandbags, overlapping fields of fire, and enough ammunition to shred anything that moved. But he didn't see another choice. There are moments in war where men act, not because they are fearless, but because they are responsible for the lives around them. And when he saw his comrades pinned down, when he heard their cries drowned by the relentless roar of German guns, something inside him refused to let the moment swallow them whole. So he stood up. He didn't wait for permission. He didn't look back. He simply rose from the snow, clutching his rifle, and stepped into the open, straight into the path of almost 20 Zalosen bullets blazing through the air. The men behind him stared in disbelief. Some shouted at him to stop. Others were too stunned to speak, but he kept moving forward, his boots crunching through snow, his breath a steady rhythm in the cold air. Bullets zipped past his ears. Snow kicked up around him. Splinters from shattered branches stung his face, and through it all, he advanced steadily, as if walking into battle was no more frightening than crossing a field back home on a Saturday afternoon. The impossible had begun. Every step he took seemed to bend the laws of reason. Bullets tore through the air, ripping chunks of snow from the ground around him. Yet somehow he didn't falter. The Germans fired in controlled bursts, in wild sprays, trying to cut him down before he reached their machine gun nest. Yet he moved with a strange combination of precision and instinct, ducking, weaving, pressing forward. His mind was a laser focus on one thing: stop the guns. Protect the men behind him. Survive if fate allowed. Some witnesses later described the scene as surreal. They said it was as if the world had slowed down, that each explosion, each crack of a bullet, hung in the air long enough for him to step around it. Others refused to believe it at all, insisting that no single human could survive the storm he walked into. But there he was, rising over a drift of snow, rifle raised, eyes locked on the target, as though sheer determination formed an invisible shield around him. He reached the first line of barbed wire, twisted and frozen from the winter frost. Normally, men would crawl under it, but he vaulted over it, landing in a crouch, feet sliding in the snow, gun trained on the enemy nest. And then he saw the Germans, their faces twisted with surprise, disbelief, and anger. They hadn't expected a lone man to appear like a ghost in the open field, defying every tactic they had learned. Time and memory blur here, but what is clear is that he fired. And he fired with calm, almost mechanical efficiency. Each round aimed, each pull of the trigger measured. The first German soldier fell, then, and another. Machine, gun, fire sputtered as panic spread through the ranks. The nest that had seemed impenetrable moments before was suddenly under siege by a man who seemed to have no regard for his own mortality. Back on the hill, his comrades watched in awe. Some tried to join him, but the path was a hurricane of lead. They were pinned down, frozen by the sheer audacity of his charge. Others shouted encouragement, their voices carried on the icy wind. They could see him, moving from cover to cover, his figure bouncing between snow mounds, each step a gamble against fate. And then something remarkable happened. The Germans hesitated. Perhaps it was disbelief. Perhaps it was the sudden realization that one determined soldier could wreak havoc on a carefully positioned nest. Either way, that hesitation gave him the opening he needed. He darted closer, rolling low behind debris, crouching as rounds ricocheted around him. He threw grenades with calculated precision, each explosion rocking the snow and timber like thunder. Within minutes, the nest that had seemed unstoppable was silenced. The enemy soldiers scrambled, some surrendering, some fleeing into the forest, bewildered by the improbable assault. And there he stood, breathing hard, blood running from a scratch on his cheek, rifle still clutched tightly, surveying the devastation he had wrought alone. What made his actions extraordinary wasn't just courage. It was the sheer improbable math of survival. Historians later calculated that somewhere around 20,000 bullets had been fired in that area during the attack, a perfect storm of death raining down. Most men in the same position would have been cut down within seconds. But he had moved like a phantom, a combination of instinct, training, and perhaps something more elusive, an iron will that refused to accept death as an option. The aftermath of his charge didn't feel like triumph, at least not immediately. His unit regrouped, tending to the wounded, counting losses, and shivering in the frozen snow. For a long time, none of them could speak above a whisper. They had seen something no one expected. They had seen a man defy reason, ignore fear, and bend a moment in time to his will. And yet, in that small act, they had won something monumental. That single charge didn't just silence a machine gun nest. It shifted the battle. It gave his comrades breathing room. It bought them time to reinforce positions, to hold a ridge that might otherwise have fallen, and to survive another day in the heart of one of the deadliest campaigns in modern history. Stories of his bravery spread slowly, at first. Letters home mentioned a miracle in the snow. Though his own modesty meant he rarely elaborated, fellow soldiers told reporters that they had never known fear and courage to coexist in one person like that. Some even joked, half in awe, that it was like watching someone stroll through a hailstorm as casually as a man walks down Main Street in town. But beneath the humor lay deep respect. They had seen heroism in its rawest, most human form, flawed, terrifying, and yet utterly necessary. The battle itself raged on for weeks. The Ardennes was a nightmare of cold mud and relentless combat. Yet that single moment. The charge, the silence of the machine, gun nest, the survival against staggering odds, became a touchstone for others. Soldiers whispered about it when morale was low. Officers referenced it when planning risky maneuvers. And though he never sought attention, history would not forget. Behind the statistics and military records lies something more human, the quiet choices that define who we are in the most extreme moments. He wasn't a superhero. He wasn't invincible. He was a young man forced into a moment where survival seemed nearly impossible. Yet he acted with a clarity and courage that few could comprehend. Later, historians would marvel at the numbers 20 Zarosand bullets fired, a single man crossing the field alive, holding a position that might have collapsed without him. But numbers can't capture the fear in a soldier's chest, the cold biting at exposed skin, the deafening roar of artillery, or the impossible focus required to act while death screams all around you. They also can't capture the quiet aftermath, the way comrades quietly nodded at one another. No, they had just witnessed something beyond explanation. There are few stories from the Second World War that encapsulate the strange, terrifying, and inspiring nature of heroism in such a raw form. This was not a planned operation, nor a scripted act of valor. It was a human being pushed to the absolute edge, responding not with calculation or strategy alone, but with instinct, courage, and a refusal to accept the end. As the days passed, his unit slowly regained strength. Supplies arrived. Reinforcements trickled in. The frozen fields were scarred by tanks and artillery, but the spirit of the men who had witnessed that charge had been renewed. They understood, perhaps better than anyone, that in war, the smallest actions, one man's decision, one split second choice, could ripple outward and change the course of events. And yet, through it all, he remained the same quiet young man from Tennessee, humble, unassuming, never one to boast, never seeking medals or headlines. To him, it was simply duty. To those who survived alongside him, it was nothing short of miraculous. The snow had begun to fall again, softening the edges of the battlefield, but the danger was far from over. Even after the machine gun nest fell silent, the German forces remained a menacing, unbroken tide. Reinforcements could be anywhere, and the forest seemed alive with movement. Shadows flickering between trees, the distant rumble of artillery, the unmistakable hum of rifle fire. He knew instinctively that survival didn't end at bravery. It ended in endurance. As he moved back to his unit, assisting wounded comrades, a new wave of enemy soldiers emerged from the fog. They were less organized this time, panicked from the sudden collapse of their defensive position, but no less lethal. Every step had to be calculated. Every move had to be precise. Yet he did not hesitate. He led, he shielded, he advanced, the embodiment of calm amid chaos. Soldiers who had been frozen in fear found courage in his presence, following him without question, trusting that somehow he knew the path through the storm. At one point, a shell exploded nearby, sending dirt, snow, and splinters into the air. A man next to him was thrown across the ground, groaning in pain. Without thinking, he lunged forward, dragging his comrade to safety while bullets whizzed past. A heart beat away from disaster. He kept moving, kept firing, kept inspiring the men around him with a force that seemed larger than life. But each step left him more exposed, every breath more dangerous. The human body has limits, and the limits were pressing against him relentlessly. And yet, somehow, he continued, hours passed like minutes. The frozen terrain became a blur of white and red. The cries of the wounded mixed with the relentless machine of battle. The Germans attempted counterattacks, desperate to reclaim lost ground, but every attempt met resistance bolstered by his actions. He was no longer just a soldier. He had become the pivot upon which the outcome of this small but crucial engagement depended. His comrades later said they could feel the rhythm of his movement. Diving, the unwavering determination in his eyes, and how that alone seemed to guide them through the chaos. They weren't just following orders. They were following someone who seemed to have transcended fear. And in war, courage is contagious. One man's defiance can ripple through a unit, turning panic into action, despair into resolve. By nightfall, the battlefield was littered with the remnants of the clash, broken trees, abandoned weapons, and soldiers too exhausted to move. But his unit had survived. They had held the line against overwhelming odds, and much of that success traced directly back to the courage of one young man who had stared death in the face and refused to blink. When the artillery finally quieted and the fog lifted, the scale of what had happened began to sink in. Medics counted the wounded. Officers tallied the enemy casualties. Survivors exchanged looks of disbelief and relief. Somewhere in the snow, on footprints, marked the path of the extraordinary charge, a testament to what one determined person could achieve in the midst of chaos. Yet even as the world began to take notice, he remained unchanged. He didn't speak of heroics. He didn't ask for recognition. To him, it was simply what had to be done. The real story was in the men who had survived, the mission that had succeeded against impossible odds, and the line that had held when so many believed it would fall. His name would eventually appear in dispatches, newspapers, and history books. But in the trenches that day, it was never about fame. It was about duty, courage, and the raw, unfiltered will to survive and protect others. In the years that followed, historians and veterans alike would revisit the event again and again. They would calculate the odds, examine the battlefield, and try to understand how a single human being could survive something as improbable as 20,000 bullets raining down. They would debate whether it was luck, skill, divine providence, or sheer mental fortitude that carried him through. The truth, perhaps, is a combination of all these things, but no amount of analysis could fully capture the human element. The fear, the focus, the resolve, and the heart of a man who refused to surrender to impossibility. Letters written long after the war reveal glimpses of his own reflections. He never exaggerated. He never framed it as extraordinary. To him, it was simply another day, another task, another duty fulfilled. But to those who witnessed it, it became a legend, a story of courage that transcended ordinary understanding. Soldiers spoke of it in quiet tones, parents read about it in newspapers, and even decades later, young recruits were taught that there are moments in history when one person's resolve can alter the course of events in ways that seem unimaginable. That winter in the Ardennes became more than a battle. It became a symbol of what is possible, when determination overrides fear, when action outpaces hesitation, and when ordinary people are called to perform extraordinary deeds. His story reminds us that even in the darkest, coldest, and most chaotic moments, there exists the possibility for heroism, for selflessness, and for the miraculous. In the end, the battle faded into history, but the legend of that day remained. The snow melted. The trees healed their scars. The guns were silenced, yet the memory of a lone young man walking into impossible odds, defying bullets, as if they were nothing more than a Saturday afternoon nuisance, continued to inspire. We remember him not because he sought recognition, not because he wanted fame, but because he reminded us all that courage is not measured by the size of the battlefield, the number of enemies, or the odds stacked against you. Courage is measured by the willingness to act, to move forward when all reason says you should run, and to stand tall when every force around you tries to pull you down. History will never forget the boy from Tennessee, and the young private who became a legend not through words but through action. He walked into the impossible, survived against staggering odds, and emerged with nothing more than a steady heart and an unwavering sense of duty. And for anyone who doubts what human courage can achieve, one look at that snowy battlefield is all the proof they will ever need. Because sometimes the most incredible victories are not the ones measured by territory gained or enemies defeated, but by the lives saved, the courage ignited, and the story that lives on long after the guns have fallen silent.